So as I mentioned, and as our bar mitzvah men can tell you, this Shabbat we find ourselves returning back to the very beginning of everything there is. This week we read from Parshat Bereshit, the very first chapters from the book of Genesis, which describe God's creation of the universe at the very beginning of cosmic time. God separates light from darkness and sea from land, the depths of the ocean from the height of the heavens. And on earth, God makes a garden, the most perfect, unspoiled spot on this green and fertile planet, a garden called Eden. And in it, God places vegetation to flower and fruit, animals to make their nests and burrows, and a sparkling river to run through it. And finally, to care for the garden, to shepherd and steward God's creations, the first human beings, one man and one woman, Adam and Eve. And everything is perfect, but not for long. We all know the story, the tree of knowledge and the wily snake, the eating of the forbidden fruit and the angels with flaming swords exiling the humans from the garden and preventing them from ever going back to Eden. And it is sad, but no doubt true, that we also know the story about how this noble and poetic myth has been used not just in our tradition, but in other faiths and traditions around the world, to arrive at some very specific and deeply misogynistic conclusions. Over the years since it was written, Eve's character has been rewritten to become the villain of the story. Centuries of scholars and exegetes from numerous religious traditions want us to learn from the story that Eve's capitulation to the snake, her disobedience of God's warning about the tree of knowledge, and her decision to eat the fruit can be ascribed to moral failing, a character flaw that is somehow inherent in her femaleness. The argument is made that everything fell apart in the Garden of Eden because women are impressionable and unreliable. But let's remember that Adam was just as guilty of eating the fruit as Eve was, and yet, as far as I can tell, there are no parallel moral claims made in the religious literature about how men are unreliable or susceptible to temptation because of their maleness. And so poor Eve becomes the unwitting and unfortunate scapegoat, at whose feet are placed millennia of sexist stereotypes about temptation and sin. But what's interesting is that in the Hebrew Bible's telling of the story, there is no place in this account of the Garden of Eden in which the Torah says anything about sin at all. Yes, being ejected from the garden and becoming mortal were the cost of the transaction God presented to them, but those things were natural consequences of Adam and Eve's decisions, not moral violations. The Torah never uses the Hebrew words for sin or transgression in describing what happened in Eden. These were simple consequences of tasting the fruit that were also beneficial to Adam and Eve. Let's remember they gained discernment and knowledge. They gained the wisdom to know the difference between right and wrong. They attained the ability and ingenuity to become self-reliant, tilling the soil and subsisting on its produce, and reaching a new stage of spiritual maturity far more expansive than their childhood in Eden. In fact, it is not at all out of the question that perhaps God wanted Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge, because what we know about God is that just as much as God desires obedience, God also relishes moral decision-making. Of course, the powerful forces of religious moralization over the years haven't seen it exactly this way and have distorted the story of Eve to be one about sin and shame and spiritual contamination, which according to some religious traditions is so powerful that it infects every subsequent generation of human life. Even in some corners of our own Jewish world, increasing levels of religious stringency has legislated steadily increasing requirements about the modesty of women, about the clothing women can wear, and the way that women must cover their heads, and has even banished photographs of women from the largest magazines and newspapers serving ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in America. With every year that passes, it becomes even more infuriating to see that our world has not yet moved beyond these curbs on women's liberty. It is surprising, but maybe it shouldn't be, to note how many places in our world continue to energetically restrict women's clothing and speech, women's access to the halls of power and the gifts of technology and education. Even autonomy over their own bodies is no longer a right that can be taken for granted in far too many places in our nation and around the world. But what's happening in those cases politically is similar to what's happening literarily in the history of interpretation of the Genesis story. The possibility of Eve's freedom is so radical and so upsetting that it must be remedied by Adam's strength. In addition to their exile from the garden, God says Eve's fate will lie in the pain of childbirth and in her condemnation to a world in which her husband will have dominion over her. What followed that verse and its interpretation have been centuries of religious and cultural ideas in which the prospect of seeing women who are fully free, fully autonomous, with all the rights and privileges extended to men is so threatening that men's power must be marshaled to be brought as a brake on women's liberty. Like some of you maybe, I've been reading the reports and watching the video footage from the streets of Iran, where for over a month now, Iranian citizens have been rising up against the religious theocracy and oppression of the supreme leader and actively resisting the zealotry of the religious authorities. Virtually all sectors of Iranian society are demanding basic civil liberties that have been denied to them for so long. Industrial workers striking and walking off the job, school children confronting their teachers and principals, and people filling the streets to march and chant. All of these demonstrations were precipitated by the tragic demise of Mahsa Amini, a young woman who was beaten to death by religious authorities for having failed to wear her headscarf properly. Amini's death absolutely electrified the Iranian populace and brought Iran's women to the forefront of clashes between citizens and the regime. To try to curb these women's resistance, the Iranian authorities are doing everything they can, shutting down internet access and cell phone networks, unleashing violence on the protesters, which has led to the deaths of dozens of people. The videos are widely available online. You can watch the Revolutionary Guard and the Iranian security forces converging on protesters. And when you look more closely, you see that at the front of every crowd are women and girls of all ages, summoning extraordinary bravery to confront their adversaries and speak aloud their demands for equality and liberty. And we are reminded yet again of that age-old dynamic in which women's freedom, women's yearning for liberty and autonomy, is met with powerful repression and the use of violent and even deadly force at the hands of men. One of the primary ideas that undergirds my view of the world is that the human desire for freedom is a political impulse, but it is also a spiritual one. This is a major component of my religious life as well as my civic life. I see in the protests against the Iranian theocracy a deeply human yearning to be free, to have access to the rights that are our due as human beings. I feel this at my core, both as an American and as a Jew. I can't say if the protesters filling the streets of Tehran will be successful. I do believe that many more people are likely to be hurt or killed before this chapter of history comes to an end. But I also believe that even if this chapter isn't successful, another one will be. People will not be oppressed forever. And any system which wagers its future on the repression of its citizens will know that its days are numbered. Over many centuries, the stories of the beginning of our Torah, the stories of Genesis and the Garden of Eden, have been misinterpreted and misread, in my opinion, to become stories about sin and shame instead of stories about maturation and growth. For men and women alike, we lose more than we gain from a reading like that of the words of Scripture. There's a poet named Shirley Kaufman who imagines a scene in Eden during the last morning that Adam and Eve will share together there. She imagines Eve waking up early and leaving Adam's side to explore the garden. She stops at the edge of a lake and peers down into its surface. She sees her reflection there in the water, but doesn't recognize it. And so she reaches down to gather the image into her hands. But the water ripples and it is lost. It's only water, the poet writes, but she wants it to tell her who she is and what he lost. The Garden of Eden story is not a story about sin. It's a story about yearning and desire. It's about decisions and consequences. And though it has been twisted into some disturbing shapes about sexism and shame that fuel the contempt of women's bodies and deny women's ambition, most disappointingly, it has become the source of deep antagonism between men and women, driving a rift between us and forging a mistaken conception of a world in which women's freedom and men's strength are used for leverage against each other. And it doesn't have to be that way. It is true, the story reminds us that we can't make our way back to Eden. The angels and the flaming swords will see to that. But instead, we can commit to working together, to move ourselves slowly, one step at a time, one day after another, back towards a reflection of what paradise once looked like, where all humans, regardless of our gender, are entitled to our freedom. And in that world, we will come to see what God intended for us, a world in which it is our freedom that becomes the source of our strength. Shabbat shalom, everybody.